For decades, the Rowanson family has hidden its darkest truth. Until now. A long-lost portrait, a brother thought to be dead, and a fire that was never an accident. Jacob Reynolds is closer than ever to uncovering the past that destroyed his family, but with every answer comes a new danger. Kieran Rowanson, the aging patriarch, is finally ready to confess, but will he survive long enough to do so? And as Jacob inches toward the truth, Lena and her ruthless allies are already moving to silence him, permanently. What really happened the night of the fire? Why did Kieran disown his daughter? And what secrets is the silent man in the shadows hiding? Stay tuned, because part 2 is about to change everything. Drop your theories in the comments. Who do you think is pulling the strings behind the Rowanson fortune? Kieran Rowanson's bedroom was elegant yet impersonal, more akin to a high-end hotel suite than a space someone had truly lived in. The curtains were half-drawn, allowing a gentle half-light to filter through, casting long, muted shadows across the room. Beside the grand 4-poster bed, propped on a special easel, was the black portrait. Kieran himself sat near the window in a high-backed chair, a woolen blanket draped over his legs despite the warmth of the room. At 85, he retained an imposing presence. His silver hair neatly combed, his posture rigid even as illness gnawed at him. Yet the slight tremor in his hands, resting on the blanket's edge, betrayed the weakness he refused to acknowledge. "Mr. Reynolds," Kieran greeted, his voice stronger than his frail form suggested. "Thank you for coming. G, you may leave us." G hesitated, his gaze shifting between Kieran and Jacob before reluctantly exiting, the door clicking shut behind him. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Kieran spoke again. "You've done remarkable work on the East Wing doors. I recognize the craftsmanship immediately. Restoration isn't just about skill, it requires intuition, the ability to see what once was and bring it forth again." Jacob met his gaze. "Thank you, sir." Kieran's piercing blue eyes, the same shade as Jacob's mother's, studied him with quiet intensity. "You remind me of someone," Kieran mused. "A young man who once worked these grounds. Jack Reynolds." "Any relation?" Jacob's heart pounded. "My father." Kieran's expression didn't shift. If the revelation surprised him, he gave no sign. "Ah," he murmured. He was talented as well, a different medium, gardening rather than woodwork, but he had the same understanding of living things. Jacob swallowed, his pulse quickening. "You knew him well?" "Well enough." Kieran gestured toward the chair opposite him, his fingers unsteady but deliberate. "Please, sit. Tell me, what do you think of that portrait?" Jacob lowered himself into the chair, his gaze drawn once more to the black portrait. "It's significant," he said carefully. "A family piece, though not originally a Rowanson heirloom." Kieran nodded, his expression unreadable. "Margaret brought it into the household some years ago, said it deserved proper preservation." Jacob considered his next words. "It's been well maintained?" "Yes." Kieran's gaze never left Jacob's face. "The woman in the portrait, she has remarkable eyes, don't you think?" Jacob met his stare. "Yes, the same shade as yours." The words settled between them, heavy yet unchallenged. Neither a question nor an accusation, just truth laid bare. Kieran exhaled slowly, his hand pressing against the blanket covering his lap. "I'm an old man, Mr. Reynolds, old and unwell. Time has a way of sharpening clarity. There was a time when pride and propriety seemed worth any sacrifice." His eyes flickered toward the portrait. "Now, I find myself questioning the wisdom of choices made long ago." Jacob followed his gaze to the image of his mother, Sienna, cradling her infant sons. "Sometimes the most important things are the easiest to lose," Jacob murmured. Kieran's sharp blue eyes flicked back to him, something indefinable passing through them. "You sound like her." He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement, but there was a quiet determination in his voice as he continued. "I've been reviewing my affairs," Kieran admitted, "making certain adjustments, ensuring that all obligations are properly addressed." Jacob met his gaze steadily. "I understand." "Do you?" Kieran leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not certain you do. There are forces in this house that resist change, Mr. Reynolds. Forces that have spent decades ensuring a particular order remains intact." Jacob met his eyes. "Mrs. Rowanson." There was no point in pretense. Kieran's lips pressed together, neither confirming nor denying. My wife has been a capable steward of the Rowanson name, he said carefully. But blood is blood, Mr. Reynolds, Jacob finished. His voice was steady. And in the end, that's what remains. The words hung between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Before Kieran could respond, the bedroom door opened. Lena stood in the doorway, the picture of composed elegance, though her expression was pure ice. Her gaze swept over the room, taking in the scene before her. "Kieran, darling, you should be resting," she said, her voice a practiced blend of warmth and authority. Then, to Jacob, with the faintest suggestion of a smile, "Mr. Reynolds, I'm sure you have duties elsewhere." Kieran straightened in his chair, his bearing defiant despite the tremor in his hands. "Mr. Reynolds is here, at my request, Lena." "Of course, dear." Lena moved toward him, her fingers settling lightly, possessively, on his shoulder. "But Dr. Mercer was quite clear about limiting visitors," she continued smoothly. "Particularly during your medication times." Jacob exhaled quietly, reading the message beneath her words. The audience was over. He rose. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Rowanson." As he moved toward the door, Kieran's voice followed him. "Mr. Reynolds, I'd appreciate it if you'd look at the library paneling next week. I believe some of the original details warrant your attention." Jacob glanced back, catching the flicker of something in Kieran's expression. An invitation. A warning. "I'd be happy to, sir." Lena's fingers tightened just slightly on Kieran's shoulder. "I'll have Juliet show you out," she said coolly. In the hallway, Jacob found G waiting, his expression unreadable. Without a word, Jacob followed him back toward the service stairs, his mind spinning. Kieran knew, or at least he suspected, and he was changing his will. No wonder Lena was panicking. They had just reached the bottom of the stairs when G's hand shot out, gripping Jacob's arm in a silent warning. His other hand lifted to his ear, then gestured toward the nearby morning room, where voices filtered through the partially opened door. "I don't care how you do it, Frederick." Lena's voice was taut with barely restrained fury. "This needs to be handled immediately. He's asking too many questions, getting too close. Like mother, like son." A man's chuckle followed, low, amused. "Frederick, don't worry, Lena. I took care of the problem 30 years ago, didn't I? Some problems just need a little fire to solve them." E's fingers tightened on Jacob's arm, his grip ironclad. His whole body was trembling, his scarred face rigid with barely contained rage. Jacob exhaled slowly, steadying a hand on G's shoulder, feeling the fury coursing through him. He didn't need to hear another word. He knew with absolute certainty. M was Graham, his brother, the twin who hadn't died in that fire after all. And the same people who had set that fire were now planning something just as ruthless to keep their grip on the Rowanson fortune. The garden behind the Rowanson mansion was the only refuge Jacob could find that afternoon. After overhearing Lena's conversation with Frederick, he had rushed back to the conservatory, relief washing over him at the sight of Zara happily locked in a drawing contest with Juliet. G had vanished. His rigid stance and shaking hands had spoken volumes. He needed space. Jacob understood. He needed it too. Now, as the evening shadows stretched across the estate, Jacob sat on a stone bench, half concealed by overgrown hedges, unfolding the paper Juliet had slipped him. The copied journal entries were written in her precise, careful script. April 11th, 1996. Lena confronted me today about my visits to Sienna and the boys. She knows. I denied everything, but it was useless. She sees too much. Your loyalty should be to this family, she told me, as if Sienna and her sons are not Rowansons by blood. I fear what she might do. Kieran remains oblivious, locked away in his study with his bourbon and his regrets. April 13, 1996. Overheard Lena speaking with Frederick something about electrical issues. Unfortunate accidents happen all the time. I must warn Sienna. April 15, 1996. We'll visit tonight. I've prepared an excuse, taking the portrait for restoration. The boys turn 8 tomorrow. I've hidden their presents in my bag. April 16, 1996. God forgive me. The fire. It happened too fast. I had just left with the portrait when I heard the explosion. I turned back, saw the flames engulfing the house. I ran toward them, but I could only reach Graham, unconscious near a shattered window. Sienna was still inside, calling for Jacob. Jack was fighting through the flames, trying to reach them. I had to choose, get Graham to safety or go back for the others. The boy was so badly burned, his screams still echo in my mind. By the time the fire trucks came, I had already slipped away with him. I couldn't risk Lena discovering he had survived. My sister in Maine will keep him safe for now, until I can figure out something more permanent. I pray Jacob and Jack made it out, but there has been no word. May 31, 1996. At last, news of Jack and Jacob. Both survived, but Jack is lost to drink now. Jacob has been placed in foster care. I've arranged quiet financial support through a lawyer friend. Graham asks for his brother constantly, but the trauma has stolen his voice. The doctor says the damage may be permanent. The burns are healing, but slowly. He will carry these scars forever. When he is strong enough, I will tell him the truth. About Heir, about his bloodline, about Lena's betrayal. For now, it is safer to let him believe his family is gone. Safer to let him forget. Jacob exhaled, gripping the pages as the weight of the past settled over him. They had been right there, both of them. So close. And yet, for almost 3 decades, they had lived as ghosts in each other's lives. And all of it, every shattered moment, led back to Lena. Jacob folded the paper with trembling hands. It was the final confirmation of what he had already begun to suspect. The fire that killed his mother hadn't been an accident. Lena and her cousin Frederick had orchestrated it, calculated, deliberate, meant to sever any lingering connection between Kieran and Sienna's family, and Graham had survived. Rescued by Margot, hidden away, raised in secret to protect him from Lena's reach. A shadow stretched across the stone bench. Jacob looked up. Rowan stood over him, his expression unreadable. Planning to spend the night in our garden, Reynolds. Jacob stood, bracing himself for the confrontation. Just taking a break before finishing up? A break that involves reading mysterious notes? Rowan's sharp gaze flicked to the folded paper in Jacob's hand. Work calculations, Jacob lied smoothly, for the materials I need to order. Rowan studied him in silence, his stare unsettlingly like Lena's. Assessing, dissecting. You've been spending a lot of time with my father lately. Mr. Rowanson has taken an interest in the restoration work. Has he? Rowan's tone sharpened, his polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the edge beneath. Funny, he's never cared much for household maintenance before. Then again, he's grown rather sentimental in his old age. Age does that, I suppose. Jacob remained silent. He wasn't about to be baited. My mother thinks you're after something, Rowan continued, circling him like a predator testing its prey. Money, perhaps? A sob story for the old man? Hoping for a handout? Jacob held his ground. I'm just doing the job I was hired to do. Are you? Rowan stopped directly in front of him, his smile devoid of warmth. Because it seems to me you've been doing quite a bit more than restoring woodwork. Exploring private areas of the house, meeting secretly with staff, examining family heirlooms with unusual interest. Jacob met his gaze without flinching. If you're unhappy with my work, I can leave the project unfinished. That won't be necessary. Rowan's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. In fact, I think it's important you finish your work here. Every last detail. The weight behind his words was unmistakable. Jacob exhaled slowly, refusing to rise to the bait. My daughter is waiting for me. Ah, yes, your daughter, Zara, isn't it? Rowan's voice was light, almost amused. Charming child. Jacob stiffened. It would be a shame if anything disrupted her stable little life. Children need security, don't they? A reliable home, a dependable parent. Jacob stopped, mid-step, turning back toward him. His voice was low, steady. Are you threatening my daughter? Rowan's expression remained pleasant, but the silence that followed said everything. Simply making an observation about the vulnerability of single-parent households, Rowan said smoothly. Social services can be so interventionist these days. Jacob's hands curled into fists at his sides. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the taut silence. Juliet appeared around the hedge. Mr. Reynolds, your daughter is asking for you. And Mr. Rowan, your mother is looking for you. Something about the charity auction tomorrow. Rowan's expression shifted in an instant, the cool menace vanishing behind a mask of effortless charm. Of course, he said, adjusting his cuffs. We'll continue our chat another time, Reynolds. Jacob didn't reply. As Rowan strode away, Juliet placed a hand on Jacob's arm, her grip firm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not here. The garden has cameras." She led the way back inside where they collected Zara before heading toward the east wing. There, amid the partially restored woodwork, they had a legitimate reason for their presence, cover for a conversation that couldn't be risked anywhere else. Juliet shut the door behind them, pressing her back against it before exhaling sharply. "What happened with Kieran?" she asked urgently. Jacob kept his voice low as Zara wandered the room, running her fingers over the intricate carvings. "He knows who I am, or at least he suspects. He's changing his will, and Lena knows it." Juliet's lips pressed into a thin line. "That explains the emergency calls to the family lawyer this morning." She cast a wary glance toward the hallway. "And Rowan just threatened Zara and me, although in the most polite terms possible." Juliet paled. "You need to be careful." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Rowan may seem less dangerous than Lena, but he's just as ruthless. He's been groomed his entire life to protect the Rowanson fortune." Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded journal pages. "I found out about the fire," he said. "Lena and Frederick engineered it to kill my mother and sever any claim we might have on the Rowanson name." Juliet inhaled sharply. "And G is Graham, my brother. Margot saved him from the fire." Juliet met his gaze, nodding slowly, her expression grave. "I know. I suspected as much," Juliet said quietly, "but G never confirmed it. He keeps his past locked away as tightly as he keeps his voice." "Why wouldn't he tell me?" Jacob murmured. "All these years I thought he was dead." "Fear, perhaps. Or protection. Margot always said the less people knew, the safer everyone would be." Juliet glanced at her watch, her expression tightening. "I need to get back before I'm missed." "What will you do now?" Jacob exhaled slowly. "I need to speak with G. Graham, and I need to find proof of what Lena and Frederick did. Margot's journal entries wouldn't stand up in court." Juliet hesitated, then said, "There may be something in Kieran's safe, the one behind the sailboat painting in his study." Jacob's mind raced. "I'll need a distraction to access it. And the combination? Leave that to me." Juliet's gaze was resolute. "Tomorrow night, Lena's charity auction will empty the house of most staff. I'll create a reason for you to return." She hesitated before adding, "Jacob, if you find proof..." "What then?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Justice for my mother, and protection for what's left of my family." His gaze drifted to Zara, who was carefully tracing the ornate doorframe he had been restoring, her small fingers moving along the intricate patterns. "Including my daughter." Juliet gave a small nod, then slipped away. Jacob knelt beside Zara, guiding her fingers over the carvings. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "why does that man, G, look at you so funny? Like he knows you from somewhere." Jacob's pulse stuttered. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "When he thinks you're not looking, he watches you. Like..." She frowned, searching for the right words. "Like in that movie where the soldier comes home and sees his family again, out of the mouths of babes." Jacob forced a steady breath. "Maybe he reminds me of someone too." Zara nodded sagely, accepting the answer, but Jacob knew the truth was far more complicated. "His eyes look like yours." "Same color?" Jacob glanced down at Zara, her small face thoughtful, her gaze steady. "You noticed that, huh?" "I notice lots of things." She looked up at him with her mother's earnest expression, an expression that always made his chest tighten. "Is he your friend?" Jacob thought about the brother he had mourned for 30 years, the twin who had survived fire and loss, who had been watching over him from the shadows, silently carrying the weight of a shared past. "I hope so, Zara," he said softly. "I really hope so." Later that night, after tucking Zara into bed, Jacob found a small package waiting outside his apartment door. Inside was a silver USB drive and a folded note, the handwriting unmistakable. G's distinctive, slightly shaky script. Security camera footage from 1995. Margot kept everything. Watch alone. Some ghosts should stay buried until the right time. Not safe for Zara to know yet. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Main gate, Lena and Rowan at auction. Kieran in study. Your chance for truth. Graham. For the first time, his brother had signed his real name. Jacob sat in the dim light of the living room, the glow of his laptop screen casting sharp angles across his face. He had already watched the footage twice, but he played it again as if repetition might unearth something new. something he hadn't yet seen. The grainy, time-stamped video began. April 15, 1996, the night before the fire. The rear entrance of Rowanson Mansion. Margot emerged carrying a large cloth-wrapped package. The black portrait, without a doubt. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before hurrying to her car. As she pulled away, another figure appeared at the edge of the frame. Lena. Standing in the shadows, phone pressed to her ear, watching Margot leave. The footage jumped. April 16th, early morning. A different camera angle. Margot's car returning, but this time she wasn't alone. In her arms was a small, motionless form, a child wrapped in a singed blanket. His face was turned away, but Jacob didn't need to see it. He knew Graham. Margot hurried inside through the service entrance. After that, she never appeared on the mansion cameras again that day. The video ended. Jacob exhaled slowly, his pulse loud in the quiet, more questions than answers. Why had Margot taken the portrait the night before the fire? Had she known? No. Suspected. She had known something was coming, and the truth hit Jacob like a fist to the chest. She had tried to warn them. Her journal mentioned visiting that night, using the portrait's restoration as an excuse. She must have intended to speak to Sienna and Jack to tell them her suspicions, but she hadn't known when the fire would come. By the time she returned, it was already too late. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mrs. Kelly arriving to watch Zara. He had told her it was an emergency work situation. Not entirely a lie. Tonight, he would finally get answers. The Rowanson mansion was eerily quiet as Jacob approached the rear garden gate at precisely 8:10 p.m. Charity auction had drawn away nearly everyone. Lena, Rowan, most of the staff. Only Kieran and his nurse remained inside. The evening shadows stretched long over the manicured lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wailed. A jarring intrusion in this pristine neighborhood. Graham was already waiting. Half hidden in the dim light, the scars on his face cast deeper hollows, his expression unreadable. When he saw Jacob, he wordlessly unlatched the gate. They walked in silence. Two brothers, separated by 29 years of lies, now moving in perfect synchronization. The air footsteps matched instinctively, a quiet echo of their shared DNA. But instead of leading Jacob to the main house, Graham veered toward the far end of the estate, toward a small guest cottage nestled behind the trees. Once inside, he flicked on a single lamp and handed Jacob a folded note. "We can talk here. No cameras, no listening devices." Margot made sure of it. Graham. The name felt unfamiliar on Jacob's tongue, like a word he had once known but hadn't spoken in years. Across from him, Graham flinched, his expression tightening. He grabbed a notepad and scribbled quickly, "Most know me as G now. Graham died in that fire." "But you didn't die," Jacob said quietly. "Margot saved you." Graham nodded, then wrote again, his hand unsteady. "I remember the heat, the smoke, couldn't breathe, couldn't find you. Mom was calling for us. Then darkness. Woke up with Margot in Maine. Bandages everywhere. No voice." Jacob sank into a chair, the weight of the past 3 decades pressing down on him. "All this time I thought you were dead." He swallowed hard. "Dad thought you were dead. He never recovered. Drank himself to death when I was 15. Graham's face crumpled. He gripped the pen, his writing sharper this time. "Margot told me he died when I was 10. Said you were in a good foster home, safer if everyone thought I died too." Lena would have finished the job if she knew. Jacob exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "Then why come back? Why work for them?" Graham's fingers clenched around the pen. When he wrote again, his strokes were quick, urgent. "Margot got sick. Before she died, she told Kieran everything. About Sienna being pregnant, about the twins, about the fire." Jacob stared at the words, his pulse hammering in his ears. Truth, at last. And for the first time, after nearly 30 years in the dark, he knew what had to come next. "Kieran brought me here as a driver, his penance." Graham's hand tightened around the pen as he wrote. "Lena doesn't know who I am, just the charity case with burn scars that Margot begged Kieran to help." Jacob exhaled sharply, his mind reeling. "But why didn't you find me once you were here? Let me know you were alive." Graham's response was swift, each stroke of ink etched with years of restraint. Too dangerous. Lena watching, Rowan watching. Margaret said wait for the right moment, then you appeared, working on doors, like the universe bringing us back together. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, emotions rising in his chest like a tidal wave. Jesus, Greg. 30 years. We lost 30 years. The weight of it pressed down on them both. Then, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Graham reached out. His scarred fingers gripped Jacob's shoulder. Tight. Desperate, as if afraid that if he let go, his brother would vanish all over again. Jacob closed his eyes for a beat, grounding himself in that moment. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. Kieran knows who you are? Graham nodded and wrote quickly. Figured it out last year, started changing his will. Lena panicked, called. Jacob stiffened. Frederick back? His stomach turned. The same Frederick who set the fire that killed our mother? Graham's eyes burned with a fury that needed no translation. He scrawled a single word across the page. Revenge. Jacob nodded slowly. But we need proof. Something that will hold up in court. Graham moved toward a small desk in the corner. Retrieving a key from his pocket, he knelt, unlocking the bottom drawer and withdrawing a heavy metal box. When he placed it on the table between them, Jacob felt his pulse quicken. Inside Margot's careful records lay in neat stacks. Her journals, photographs, and a small tape recorder lined with cassettes labeled by date. Margot recorded conversations? Jacob asked, his surprise evident. Graham nodded, selecting a tape labeled April 13, 1996. He inserted it into the recorder and pressed play. A burst of static, then a woman's voice. Smooth, calculated. Lena. Becoming a problem, Frederick. Margot's been visiting them regularly. If Kieran ever found out, Sienna has twin boys. The sound of a man's gruff voice cut in. Jacob's breath stilled. At last the truth had a voice. So? The old man disowned her, right? Not like they have a legal claim? Don't be stupid. Lena's voice was sharp, controlled. Kieran's getting sentimental in his old age. Last week I caught him looking at Sienna's childhood photos. If he reunites with her, if he meets those boys, everything we've worked for is at risk. I need this problem eliminated. A pause. Then, what exactly are you asking, Lena? You know people who can make accidents happen. Electrical fires are common in older buildings. Silence. Then, a man's voice. Frederick's? Gruff with hesitation. This is different than our usual arrangements, Lena. We're talking about your stepdaughter. Children? Lena scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. She's not my anything. She's the mistake Kira made with his first wife, a mistake that needs to be permanently erased before it costs us millions. The recording cut off, leaving the room in suffocating silence. Jacob sat frozen, the weight of Lena's words pressed down on his chest, cold and heavy. This is it, he whispered. Proof that she orchestrated the fire. Across from him, Graham nodded grimly. He picked up the pen and wrote with steady purpose. More tapes, more evidence. Been collecting for years, waiting for the right time. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. Why wait? Why not take this to the police immediately? Graham's response came swiftly. Kieran dying. Cancer doctors give weeks. New will name us both. You, me, Zara, need to protect him until it's official. Jacob exhaled sharply. He hadn't expected that. Lena and Rowan. Do they know? Do they suspect something's changing? Graham nodded, his expression grim. Lawyer visits, Kieran, asking about you? Not sure they suspect me yet? Before Jacob could respond, a sudden urgent knock at the door made them both jolt. Graham shot him a warning look before moving cautiously to the entrance. He cracked it open just enough to see Juliet. Her face was flushed, her breath uneven. You need to come quickly, she gasped. Kieran's collapsed. He's asking for both of you. Graham and Jacob exchanged a charged glance before breaking into a sprint, trailing Juliet across the darkened garden toward the main house. The night air crackled with an almost tangible tension, their hurried footsteps muffled by the manicured lawn. They slipped through the kitchen entrance, moving swiftly up the service stairs. Every second felt stretched thin. At the top, Kieran's bedroom door stood ajar, a single bedside lamp casting a dim golden glow over the room. Kieran lay propped against the pillows, his skin ashen, his breath rasping through an oxygen cannula. The nurse at his bedside adjusted the tubing, her expression professional but grave. When Kieran's weary eyes settled on them, both of them, a flicker of peace softened his gaunt features. With a trembling hand, he beckoned them closer. "My boys," he whispered, voice Sienna's boys, at last. Beside Jacob, Graham went rigid, the weight of decades pressing into the space between them, but they moved as one, stepping forward in perfect, unspoken rhythm. Two halves of the same fractured history. "Mr. Rowanson," Jacob began, Kieran's lips curled in faint disapproval. "Grandfather," he corrected, the title escaping with effort. "Should have acknowledged you long ago. Pride, such a destructive force." Graham hesitated, then reached out, his scarred fingers closing gently around Kieran's frail hand. The old man's breath hitched, his watery eyes reflecting something between regret and relief. "Graham," he rasped, squeezing weakly, "my quiet warrior, watching over us all these years." Then, turning to Jacob, his expression softened further. "And Jacob, so like your mother, her strength, her talent." Jacob swallowed hard. "Sir?" "Grandfather," he corrected himself, the word unfamiliar, untested. "You need to rest. We can talk when you're stronger." Kieran exhaled shakily. No more time for waiting. Papers signed, new will filed. But Lena, he drew a rattling breath, dangerous when cornered. As if summoned by the mere mention of her name, a furious commotion erupted in the hall. Lena's voice, sharp, indignant, cut through the heavy air like a blade. "What do you mean I'm not allowed in? He's my husband." The nurse moved swiftly to the door, shutting it with practiced efficiency and locking it with a quiet click. "Mr. Rowanson's orders," she murmured. "No visitors except those specifically named." A beat of silence. Then, Lena's voice again, this time colder, more controlled. "I see." A quiet statement, but beneath it a promise of war. Kieran's fading eyes locked onto Jacob's, a silent urgency burning through the weakness overtaking him. "The safe," he whispered, voice barely more than breath. "Behind the sailboat, everything you need to protect yourselves." Graham's fingers tightened around his grandfather's frail hand, his scarred knuckles whitening with emotion. Tears spilled silently down his cheeks, but this time he refused to remain voiceless. For the first time in 30 years, he fought against the damage, forced sound through ravaged vocal cords, straining to form a single word. "Thank you." The sound was hoarse, raw, and broken, but it filled the room, and for the first time in decades it seemed to fill Kieran too. The old man exhaled, strength flickering back into his grip as he clasped both their hands. "Find the truth, all of it. Make this family what it should have been." Beyond the heavy door, Lena's voice sharpened like a blade. "You can't keep us out forever." The handle rattled, hard. "Rowan, call Dr. Mercer immediately. Tell him Kieran is being isolated from family during a medical emergency." The nurse's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Time is running out." Graham's gaze darted to the adjoining study. He motioned swiftly. Juliet caught on instantly. "The safe," she murmured. "I'll try to buy you time." As she strode toward the door, bracing for confrontation, Graham and Jacob slipped into Kieran's private study, closing the connecting door with the careful precision of men who had spent a lifetime moving unseen. The study was a monument to legacy. Walls lined with leather-bound books, the scent of aged paper mingling with polished mahogany. A hand-knotted Persian rug softened their footsteps. Everything about the space spoke of old money, careful curation, and generations of power. But Jacob had eyes only for the painting. The sailboat, dark against a stormy sea, stood in stark contrast to the room's otherwise stately decor. He reached for the frame, lifting it carefully from the wall. Behind it, a steel safe gleamed in the lamplight. Without hesitation, Graham pressed a slip of paper into Jacob's hand. 0.5, 2.9, 88. Their birthday. Jacob's fingers were steady as he turned the lock. The quiet click broke the tense silence and the door swung open, revealing its secrets. Inside, folders thick with documents lay neatly stacked beside a velvet jewelry box. But it was the manila envelope that caught Jacob's eye. Contingencies, written in Kieran's familiar, elegant script. "This must be it," he murmured, reaching for it. Then, the unmistakable sound of the bedroom door creaking open. They froze. Lena's voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the thin wall. "Kieran, darling, what's this nonsense about restricted visitors? I came as soon as I heard you were unwell." Lena's voice dripped with faux concern, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Kieran's response was too weak to carry, but whatever he said made Lena bristle. "Who's been in here? That nurse has no authority to— Mrs. Rowanson, the nurse interrupted, her tone firm but professional. Mr. Rowanson explicitly requested limited visitation, she continued. His condition is fragile. Too much excitement could worsen. I know my husband's condition better than anyone, Lena snapped. Where is Juliet? And where is that driver? They were seen entering this room. In the study, Jacob and Graham locked eyes. Graham scrawled a single word on the notepad: window. No hesitation. Jacob secured the envelope inside his jacket while Graham unlatched the window, easing it open onto a narrow balcony. The night air bit at their skin as they stepped outside, careful to keep their movements silent. Inside, another voice joined the confrontation. Mother, perhaps we should respect Father's wishes for now, Rowan urged. The doctor is on his way. Don't be naive, Rowan, Lena snapped. Something is happening and I intend to find out what. The balcony held no obvious escape. Below, the manicured garden stretched into darkness, too far to drop without injury. But to the left, Graham pointed. An oak tree, its thick branches stretching dangerously close. Jacob followed his lead, swinging over the railing and leaping for the nearest limb. Years of physical labor had kept him strong, but Graham moved with a swiftness that suggested his driver duties had been a cover for something far more demanding. They climbed down fast, dropping the final few feet just as light flooded Kieran's study. No time to think, they ran, keeping low, shadows swallowing them as they sprinted across the darkened lawn. By the time they reached the guest cottage, Juliet was already inside, her expression taut with urgency. They've called security to search the grounds, she said, breathless. We don't have much time. Jacob wasted none of it. He tore open the manila envelope, spreading its contents across the small table: legal documents, old photographs, letters, and faci ashi. A single sealed envelope. To my grandsons. Kieran's handwriting. The weight of those words settled over them, thick with meaning. Outside, the distant sound of voices grew louder. Time was running out. Graham broke the seal, his hands trembling slightly. They read together, Jacob and Graham. If you're reading this, circumstances have forced my hand before I could make proper amends in person. I have lived 3 decades knowing my pride cost me my daughter and nearly cost me my grandsons. When Margot revealed the truth about the fire and Graham's survival, I believed I could correct my mistakes gradually, carefully. I was wrong. The enclosed documents contain everything you need: proof of your parentage, evidence of Lena's crimes, and the provisions I've made to secure your future. My lawyers have been instructed to execute the new will immediately upon my death. Lena and Rowan will fight it, of course. The recordings Margot safeguarded will be your shield, but there is one truth even Margot never uncovered, a truth I carried alone. Lena's hold over Rowan goes beyond maternal influence. Rowan is not my son. He is the son of Frederick Miller, Lena's cousin and co-conspirator. A DNA test confirmed my suspicions years ago. I kept this knowledge private to spare Rowan unnecessary pain, as he himself is unaware of his true parentage. I cannot rewrite the past, but I hope this truth brings you some measure of justice. Sienna deserved better from her father, and you, both of you, deserved better from your grandfather. With deepest regret and love. Kieran Rowanson. Jesus, Jacob whispered, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. Rowan is Frederick's son? Juliet paled. That explains why Lena has always been so protective of him. Beyond normal maternal instinct, she wasn't just securing his inheritance, she was guarding a secret that could destroy her position in society. Graham was already rifling through the other documents, pulling out a stack of bank statements. He slid them toward Jacob, jabbing a finger at a series of transactions. Regular deposits into offshore accounts dating back 30 years, right after the fire. Jacob exhaled sharply. Payoffs, Graham nodded grimly. Blood money. And now, after decades of secrets and lies, they finally had proof. Kieran kept meticulous records of Lena's financial activities. Every suspicious transaction, every offshore deposit, Juliet murmured, flipping through the pages. But if he suspected her involvement in Sienna's death, why wouldn't he confront her? Jacob exhaled, his grip tightening around the edge of the table. Because he shared the guilt. He had driven Sienna away, disowned her. In his mind, he had set the stage for the tragedy. He heard the weight of those words could fully settle. The sharp crackle of approaching voices sent a jolt through them. Flashlight beams slashed through the darkness outside, sweeping across the cottage window. "Security," Juliet whispered. "We need to leave, now." Graham didn't hesitate. He shoved the documents back into the envelope and scrawled a note on a scrap of paper. "Back exit through woods, car waiting." They slipped out through the rear door just as heavy footsteps reached the front entrance. The night air was thick with tension as they cut through the trees lining the property's edge, moving swiftly and silently. Beyond the dense foliage, a quiet side street emerged, and there, waiting in the shadows, sat a sleek black town car. Jacob's breath steadied. "Smart thinking, but where can we go? They'll report the car missing." Graham lifted his keys, turning the keychain between his fingers. Personal Juliet's eyes widened. "This isn't the family's car. It's yours. They won't know to look for it." Graham nodded, starting the engine. With practiced ease, he pulled away from the curb, keeping his speed controlled, his movements deliberate. For several tense moments, they drove in silence, Juliet glancing behind them, watching for signs of pursuit. "We need somewhere safe to go through these documents properly," Jacob said finally. "Somewhere Lena wouldn't think to look." Juliet hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I might know a place. My cousin owns a small bed and breakfast in Connecticut. Off-season, mostly empty. We'd have privacy." Graham adjusted their route without question as they drove. Jacob's phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Kelly Everett. "Everything okay? Zara's asleep but asked for you earlier." Guilt crashed into him like a wave. In the chaos of the night, he had almost forgotten his daughter. "I need to get Zara," he said, his voice firm. "I can't leave her behind, not with Lena and Frederick knowing who I am." Graham's expression darkened at the mention of Frederick. His grip on the wheel tightened, knuckles whitening as he gave a grim nod and altered their course toward Jacob's apartment. When they arrived, the apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Mrs. Kelly dozed on the couch, a well-worn romance novel splayed open on her chest. Jacob moved quickly, gathering essentials for Zara, while Juliet knelt beside the babysitter, gently rousing her. "Family emergency?" she explained smoothly. "Jacob's uncle is very ill. They need to leave immediately." Still groggy, Mrs. Kelly nodded, accepting the explanation without question. Jacob lifted Zara into his arms, her small frame limp with sleep, and carried her carefully to the car. Just as he reached the curb, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled onto the street, its slow, deliberate pace setting off alarms in his mind. 2 sharp taps of the horn, Graham's warning. Jacob quickened his pace, slipping into the back seat as Graham threw the car into drive. The SUV hesitated for a fraction of a second, then surged forward. "Hold on," Graham muttered, voice tight with focus. The town car lurched forward, tires gripping the asphalt as Graham wove through narrow side streets with practiced precision. The SUV followed, gaining whenever the road opened, losing ground when Graham took sudden, unexpected turns. "How did they find us so quickly?" Juliet asked, breathless. Jacob's stomach dropped. "My phone," he realized. "They must have tracked it." He powered it off immediately, but the damage was done. Their safety margin had just disappeared. Only when they crossed the bridge, Manhattan shrinking behind them, did Jacob allow himself to breathe. The SUV was gone, lost in a maze of one-way streets and traffic congestion. Zara stirred in his arms. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily. "Where are we going?" Jacob pressed a kiss to the top of her head, keeping his voice calm. "On a little adventure, sweetheart, to meet some family." Through the rearview mirror, Zara's drowsy gaze landed on Graham. She studied his reflection for a long moment before whispering, "Is that why the quiet man with the special face is coming? Because he's family too?" Jacob met Graham's eyes in the mirror. Something unspoken passed between them. A lifetime of loss, of unspoken bonds now given shape. Graham swallowed hard but said nothing. Jacob squeezed his daughter's hand. "Yes, Zara," he said softly. "He's family, the closest family we have." Graham's scarred hands tightened on the steering wheel as they drove into the abyss of night, leaving behind the glittering Manhattan skyline and heading toward an uncertain future. But, for the first time in decades, they were facing it together. 3 days at Juliet's cousin's bed and breakfast had given them time to sift through Kieran's evidence, time to piece together the truth, and time to prepare for the battle ahead. The quaint establishment, with its faded floral wallpaper and creaking wooden floors, had become an impromptu war room. Documents were strewn across the dining table, overlapping like puzzle pieces, while Margot's cassette recordings crackled from an old tape player borrowed from the owner. For Zara, however, it was an adventure. She had taken to Graham immediately, utterly unfazed by his silence or scars. She watched him, mimicked his gestures, and within hours had devised a system of notes and hand signals between them. Now, she sat at a small side table, patiently teaching him how to fold origami frog. Her laughter, pure, unburdened, was the single bright spot in the tense, shadowed hours. Juliet hung up the landline, her expression grave. "Kieran's condition is stable but critical," she reported. Jacob barely looked up from the stack of financial records he was combing through. "Lena hasn't left his side since that night," he muttered. "She's making sure he doesn't speak to anyone else." "Any word from the lawyers?" Juliet hesitated. "They confirmed the new will was properly filed, but they can't execute it until—" She caught herself, glancing at Zara. "Until he's gone," Jacob finished quietly. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The phone rang, shrill against the silence. Juliet answered, listening for a moment before her expression flickered from caution to shock. She covered the receiver with her hand. "It's Rowan," she whispered. "He wants to speak with you." Jacob exchanged a glance with Graham before taking the phone. "This is Jacob Reynolds," Rowan's voice came through, clipped and tense. "We need to talk, in person." Jacob didn't hesitate. "I don't think that's a good idea. It's about my mother and Frederick. I found something you need to see." A pause. Then, lower, almost reluctant, I'm not who you think I am." Jacob's gaze drifted to Kieran's letter, still open on the table, the truth spelled out in careful, deliberate handwriting. "I think I know exactly who you are, Rowan," he said, his voice unreadable. Silence stretched across the line, heavy and expectant. When Rowan finally spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier composure. "Then you understand why we need to meet. Neutral ground, public place, your choice." Jacob considered for a moment before naming a busy Manhattan restaurant. Rowan agreed without hesitation. As Jacob hung up, he turned to find Graham watching him intently. "Rowan wants to meet," he explained. "Says he found something about Lena and Frederick." Graham's response was swift. He scribbled a single word on his notepad. "Trap?" "Maybe," Jacob admitted. "But he sounded different, almost desperate." Juliet frowned, arms crossed. "Kieran's letter mentioned Rowan doesn't know the truth about his father. If he's discovered it on his own, it could change everything," Jacob finished. "Or it could be Lena using him as bait." Graham jotted another note. "I'll go with you, watch from a distance." "And I'll stay with Zara," Juliet added firmly. "But be careful, Lena's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." The restaurant Jacob chose was upscale enough to ensure civility, but public enough to discourage reckless action. He arrived early, selecting a table with a clear view of both entrances. Graham positioned himself at the bar, his scarred profile partially obscured by the moody lighting. Rowan arrived precisely on time, alone, agitated. His usual pristine appearance showed uncharacteristic signs of strain. Slightly rumpled cuffs, hair not quite as perfectly styled. Without a greeting, he slid into the seat across from Jacob, his expression tight. "You have Kieran's evidence," he stated bluntly. "I need to see it." Jacob leaned back, unimpressed. "Why would I show you anything?" A flicker of frustration crossed Rowan's face. His fingers tightened around the small envelope he held, knuckles paling. He exhaled sharply before pushing it across the table. "Because I found these." Jacob picked up the envelope and pulled out several yellowed pages, handwritten letters, fragile with age. The first, dated nearly 40 years ago, contained words that sent a chill down his spine. "Lena, darling, we must be more careful. If Kieran ever suspected the child isn't his, remember Singapore next month? Tell him it's a shopping trip. We'll have our time then." Jacob looked up slowly, meeting Rowan's gaze. "You really didn't know, did you?" For the first time, Rowan looked lost. "You know?" Rowan's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm beneath. "You know I'm not Kieran's biological son." "Yes." "How long?" 3 days, Jacob said. Kieran left a letter explaining everything. Rowan absorbed this with a slow, measured breath. He didn't explode, didn't lash out. Instead, he let out a quiet, humorless laugh. All my life, I've been groomed to protect the Rowanson legacy, to become worthy of inheriting an empire I apparently have no blood right to. His fingers drummed once against the table before curling into a fist. The irony is extraordinary. Is that why you wanted to meet? To confirm your parentage? No, his expression hardened. I want to know what my mother and Frederick did to Sienna Reynolds and her family. The complete truth. Jacob studied him carefully. Why now? Why do you suddenly care about a woman who died 30 years ago? Rowan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. Because I overheard them planning another accident, this time for you and your daughter. Jacob's pulse quickened. And because I found this. Rowan placed a second envelope on the table. Jacob hesitated before opening it, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in his chest. Inside were medical reports, Kieran's medical reports. His eyes scanned the pages, and dread twisted in his gut. Kieran's cancer isn't terminal, Rowan said grimly. It's responding to treatment, but someone has been tampering with his medication, adding sedatives and heart rate depressants, just enough to weaken him, to make it seem like he's fading. Jacob swallowed hard. My mother, Rowan continued, his voice dangerously even, has been slowly poisoning her husband while pretending to care for him devotedly, and I believe she did the same to her first husband, my supposed father, 20 years ago. The weight of the revelation pressed between them. Why come to me? Jacob asked. Why not go straight to the police? Rowan's jaw tightened. Because I need to understand everything first. I need to know exactly what kind of monsters created me. His voice wavered just for a second before he forced it steady again. And because I found something else in my mother's private safe. Something about the fire that killed Sienna Reynolds. Graham had shifted closer, seemingly engrossed in his drink, but his posture was taut. Listening, calculating. What did you find? Jacob pressed. Rowan exhaled sharply. Receipts for electrical components, accelerants, and a floor plan of your childhood home, with specific areas marked. A chill crawled up Jacob's spine. She kept them? Like trophies? Rowan's gaze locked onto his. For 30 years. A sharp crack shattered the moment. Graham's glass slipping from his hand, exploding against the floor. The noise turned heads briefly, but when Jacob looked back at Rowan, something in the man's expression had shifted. That's him, isn't it? Rowan's voice was quieter now, laced with something unreadable. Your brother, the one who supposedly died in the fire? Jacob didn't answer fast enough. The driver, Rowan continued, realization settling in. Gee, I always wondered why Kieran insisted on keeping him despite my mother's objections. Why he looked at him with such guilt. Graham stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his scarred face unreadable. But his eyes burned with decades of buried fury. He survived, Jacob confirmed. Margot saved him. Rowan's mouth pressed into a thin line. Margot, of course. He turned fully to Graham now. You've been watching us all these years. Waiting, planning. Graham remained silent, his gaze never wavering. Rowan swallowed. What happens now? Jacob studied him carefully. You have Kieran's evidence, I have mine. Together, it's enough to destroy your mother and Frederick. He let the weight of the words settle. But what about you? Are you collateral damage in all this? Rowan flinched slightly. That depends, he admitted. What do you want from me? I want the truth, Jacob said. All of it. Rowan hesitated, then nodded. Then I want to make it right. Whatever that means. Graham's hand landed on Jacob's shoulder. Light, but firm. A silent question. Jacob exhaled. Decision made. Kieran's birthday celebration is tomorrow night. His voice was steady. The entire New York elite will be there. A beat of silence. So will we. Yes, Rowan confirmed. Mother too. Kieran had insisted the event proceed despite his condition. The Rowanson legacy must maintain appearances, she had said. Jacob exhaled, his decision solidifying. Then that's where we'll end this, in front of witnesses, with all the evidence laid bare. Across the table, Graham scribbled on a napkin, dangerous, Lena desperate. I know, Jacob murmured, his jaw tightening. But it's time to bring everything into the light. For Mom, for us. His gaze locked onto Rowan. Are you with us? Rowan hesitated, his eyes drifting between them before settling on Graham. The man who had lived in the shadows, scarred by Lena's ruthlessness. The man who had every reason to want her destroyed. "Yes," Rowan said, his voice quieter but no less certain. "It's time this ended." As they finalized the plan, none of them noticed the woman seated at a distant table, her face veiled behind a menu, her manicured finger idly tapping a phone screen before ending the call. Lena Rowanson smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. She set down enough cash to cover her untouched drink, then slipped silently out the restaurant's side entrance. But it would not be a night to honor the Rowanson patriarch. It would mark the end of 30 years of deception, and the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. 7 months had passed since Kieran Rowanson's 84th birthday, a night that shattered one of New York's oldest families and reshaped the lives of everyone involved. Jakob stood in what had once been the grand ballroom of the Rowanson mansion, now transformed into a sprawling workshop. Sunlight streamed through newly restored windows, casting warm streaks across work tables covered in restoration projects at various stages of completion. The scent of sawdust and varnish filled the air as apprentices, many from disadvantaged backgrounds, moved purposefully between stations, their hands bringing forgotten pieces back to life. "Dad, Uncle Greg wants to know if you finished the chair for Mrs. Patterson." Zara bounded in, her school backpack bouncing against her side. At 8.5, she had adapted to their new life with remarkable ease, treating the mansion as her personal playground. "Tell him another hour," Jacob replied, smiling as he ruffled her hair. "How is school?" "We're learning about family trees," Zara said, her expression thoughtful. "I told them mine is really complicated." Jacob chuckled softly. "That's one way to put it." Even now, the memories of that fateful night played in his mind with cinematic clarity. The moment when the carefully curated illusion of the Rowanson family crumbled, before New York's elite champagne flutes had stilled mid-air. Conversations had died in stunned silence. Lena, draped in midnight blue, had been in the midst of a toast when the unthinkable happened. Kieran, frail but resolute, had struggled to his feet from his wheelchair, his voice carrying over the hushed room. "For 31 years I've lived with the knowledge that my pride cost me my daughter. Tonight I reclaim what remains of her legacy. I'd like to introduce my grandsons, Jacob and Graham Reynolds." Gasps had rippled through the ballroom as Jacob and Graham stepped forward, flanking the patriarch. Lena's face had drained of color, her champagne flute trembled in her grip. "This is absurd," she had managed, but the cracks in her composure had already begun to show. And then, Rowan had stepped forward, the weight of betrayal evident in his voice. "Your medication is being tampered with," he said, holding up medical reports. "By you, mother." Evidence followed in carefully calculated blows. Margot's recordings echoed over the mansion's sound system. Financial records flashed across screens, and finally the damning truth. Lena's private collection of trophies from the fire that had killed Sienna Reynolds. Cornered and exposed before the very people she had spent a lifetime controlling, Lena did the only thing left to her. She confessed, not in remorse, not in surrender, but in fury. "You have no idea what it's like," she had hissed, her poise crumbling at last. "Being married to a man who could never let go of his precious first family. I did what was necessary to protect what was mine." And then, the final betrayal had come. Not from Jacob, not from Graham, not even from Rowan. Frederick himself had delivered the killing blow, arriving late, oblivious to the spectacle unfolding before him. He had, out of desperation, out of arrogance, confirmed everything, believing he could still negotiate his way out. He had miscalculated. Within the hour, both he and Lena had left the mansion in police custody, charged with murder, attempted murder, and a web of financial crimes spanning decades. Justice had finally come, but for those left behind, the question remained: what came next? 7 months later, their trials were still pending, but the outcome was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning. The Rowanson name had endured its greatest scandal, not unscathed, but transformed. The dynasty Lena had fought so ruthlessly to protect no longer belonged to her. "Uncle Greg says to come to the music room when you're done," Zara added, pulling Jacob back to the present. "Rowan's coming for dinner, and Aunt Juliet made that pasta you like." "I'll be there soon," Jacob promised, brushing a final layer of fine dust from the antique chair spindle. The family they had built in the aftermath was unconventional, an odd patchwork of survivors, but it felt right. Jacob and Zara lived in the East Wing. Graham had chosen to remain in the former chauffeur's quarters, preferring the space and solitude. Rowan, despite the countless empty rooms available, had opted for a modest apartment over the garage. Juliet, the quiet force holding them all together, ran the household with her signature blend of efficiency and warmth. And Kieran, against all medical predictions, had rallied. Once the poisoning ceased, his body had begun to heal. Though still frail, he had lived long enough to witness the mansion's transformation into something Sienna would have approved of. Part workshop, part school, part home. He had seen the Rowanson Foundation renamed in her honor, a final tribute to the daughter he had failed to protect. Jacob left the workshop, brushing his hands off on a rag as he made his way through the halls. The newly restored library stood as a quiet monument to the past. Its secret compartment remained, but now it held family photographs instead of damning evidence. On the most prominent wall hung the black portrait, its surface no longer cracked, its colors painstakingly restored by Jacob's own hands. In the music room, the transformation was just as profound. Once a space meant for show rather than function, it had become the heart of their unconventional household. Jacob stepped inside to find Graham at the piano, Zara beside him, her small fingers carefully pressing the keys. Graham's voice, still rough but growing stronger, carried softly over the notes. "Sounds good," he murmured, and Zara beamed at the rare praise. The progress was slow, but steady. Though full speech remained difficult for Graham, short sentences were now within reach. He still relied on writing for more complex thoughts, but the change was undeniable. He was finding his voice again. The opposite door opened and Rowan entered, a bottle of wine in hand. The past months had softened him in subtle ways. The rigid edges had dulled, the carefully controlled composure occasionally giving way to something real. But there were still moments when the weight of all he had lost, all he had never truly possessed, settled on his shoulders. "Jacob," he said, nodding in greeting, "the Patterson restoration looks exceptional." "Thanks," Jacob replied. "It should be delivered next week." Rowan set the bottle on the table, his fingers tracing the label absently. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking around the room. The music, the warmth, the quiet resilience of the people who had become his family. "It's different now," he said finally, almost to himself. Jacob met his gaze. "It is. Not perfect, not easy, but different. And maybe in the end that was enough." Their relationship remained complicated, neither friends nor enemies, but bound by something deeper than either label could define. Shared trauma had forged an uneasy understanding between them, and now, in the aftermath of it all, they were left with a singular purpose: to rebuild something meaningful from the wreckage of the past. Kieran was the last to join them, his steps slow but steady as he moved with the aid of his walker, Juliet hovering protectively nearby. At 86, he carried the weight of his past choices in every line on his face, every careful movement. But there was something else now, too, a lightness, however faint, that came from finally setting things right. He paused in the doorway, surveying the room. Jacob, Graham, Rowan, Zara, the fractured pieces of a family, stitched imperfectly together. "My family," he said simply. Dinner was served in the informal dining room, conversation flowing easily, updates on the Foundation's latest projects, Zara's school lessons, Graham's progress with his speech therapist. The past lingered, ever present, but it no longer held them captive. It had reshaped them, yes, but they carried it together now. After dinner, as the adults lingered over coffee, Zara tugged at Graham's sleeve, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Play the song, the one Grandma Sienna liked." Graham met her expectant gaze and nodded. Without a word, he rose and led her back to the music room. One by one, the others followed, drawn in by the soft, familiar melody that soon filled the air. It was a lullaby, one Margot had often hummed while she worked, claiming that Sienna had once sung it to her twin boy. The notes drifted through the room, gentle and unbroken, as Zara sat beside Graham on the piano bench. Her small fingers hesitantly joined his on the simpler chords, and in the dimming light, her profile bore the faintest echoes of the grandmother she had never known. Jacob stood near the black portrait, watching. Now, finally, he understood why Margot had risked so much to save it the night before the fire. It was never just a painting. It was proof of lineage, of love, of a connection that no amount of deception or cruelty could erase. The one thing that had survived when everything else had burned away. Kieran moved beside him, his gaze fixed on Sienna's painted face. "She would be proud," he said softly. "Of both of you, and of her granddaughter," Jacob exhaled. "I hope so." His voice dipped, quieter now. "I just wish she could have seen all this." Graham joined them then, placing a steady hand on Jacob's shoulder. He took a breath, forming the words with careful effort. The frame, "She sees..." The words were slow but deliberate, and they landed like something sacred. "She found us." As the last notes of the lullaby faded into silence, the setting sun cast a warm golden glow through the western windows. The light touched the portrait just so, illuminating Sienna's painted eyes until they seemed to encompass everyone in the room. And on the floor, stretched by the light, the shadow of the ornate black frame curved around them, an unbroken circle, like an embrace. "She never left," Jacob murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. Outside, beyond the music room's tall windows, the gardens stretched beneath the fading evening light, lush, vibrant, reborn. Where once Lena had demanded rigid order and imported perfection, native blooms now thrived, their roots deep and untamed, reclaiming the land as it was always meant to be. The Rowanson mansion, once a fortress of wealth and illusion, had become something far more valuable, a home. Not just in name, but in spirit. A place where fractured pasts had been acknowledged, where wounds had been given the space to heal, and where the broken remnants of multiple lives had been carefully restored, each piece fitting together to form something stronger than before. Like the antique wood Jacob spent his days coaxing back to life, their family had come to understand a quiet, enduring truth. What is damaged is not beyond saving. With care, patience, and the will to mend, even what was once shattered can be made whole again. And sometimes, just sometimes, the cracks left behind make it even more beautiful. Sometimes, the past doesn't just fade, it lingers, waiting for the right moment to be seen, understood, and finally set free. The Rowanson mansion wasn't just restored, it was reclaimed. Proof that even in the wake of betrayal, loss, and decades of deception, healing is possible. Like the antique wood Jacob restored, our own scars, our broken pieces, don't mean the end. With care, with effort, they can become part of something even more beautiful, stronger, more meaningful. So tell me, what does restoration mean to you? Whether it's rebuilding trust, finding closure, or creating something new from the wreckage of the past, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's keep this conversation going. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.